There are several kid shows about sentient trains out there, which is perhaps not much of a surprise considering how cool trains inherently are. Aside from Thomas and Friends, we've covered 2 train shows on this channel, Ivor the Engine and Mighty Express. Today, however, we're looking at a little show called Underground Ernie. It's a show about a fictionalised version of the London Underground, or the International Underground as it's known in the show, and the man in charge of the railway network, whose name is Ernie if the name of the show didn't clue you in. The show has gained a cult following in recent years, so chances are you may have heard of this series before. Being a show about railways, there are a good number of trains in the show, and today I'm going to be drawing how they may have looked if they were Thomas and Friends characters. So, mind the gap and don't be nervous as I begin. I'm doing these characters in the order their names are mentioned in the show's opening theme, so I shall be starting with Victoria. Not to be confused with the coach, of course. Since Underground Ernie first aired in 2006, and Thomas and Victoria was published in 2007, Victoria from Underground Ernie technically came first, which is weird to think about. The trains in Underground Ernie, at least the main cast, are all named after lines on the London Underground. As part of the Thomasification of these characters, I've decided to go one step further and base them on the stock that operated on their respective lines. I have thus based Victoria on the 1967 stock. Given that Victoria is quite an old character in the show, it may have been more fitting to base her on an older design. But, since the Victoria line opened in 1968 with the 1967 stock, it seemed more logical to do it this way. I've decided to include Thomas in this scene for a bit of a crossover element. It's always fun seeing characters from 2 different shows you enjoy appearing together and interacting with one another. Whether it be Cartoon All-Stars to the Rescue, Peter Kay's Animated All-Star Band, the Jimmy Timmy Power Hour, and so on. I'm not sure how Thomas ended up on the Underground. Maybe this takes place during the events of Thomas and the Special Letter, or perhaps the Royal Engine, and Thomas gets sent onto the wrong line. No wonder he's so surprised. 3 rail tracks? James and Henry told me about these. They're nothing but trouble. They make you derail. I've set the scene in the International Underground station, and it only seemed fitting to include the main man himself, Ernie, in the scene as well. I've drawn him in the style of the human figures from Thomas and Friends, whilst making sure to retain some of his facial features. The human characters in Underground Ernie have a distinct look to them, and so it wasn't the easiest thing finding a middle ground. But I think I managed it in the end. One distinct feature of the trains in Underground Ernie is the faces, which take up their entire front and have a somewhat bulbous appearance, making the trains look a bit like worms or caterpillars. Come to think of it, I wonder how Colin the Caterpillar would have looked as an Underground Ernie character. I remember during Queen Elizabeth's Platinum Jubilee, M&S brought out a Queen Caterpillar cake, which I thought looked quite a lot like Victoria. Another thing to note about the train's faces in Underground Ernie is the lack of eyebrows. Perhaps they'd look less creepy if they had eyebrows. Maybe not. As I'm drawing these characters in the Thomas style, their faces will be below their front windows. Since I'm going for a TV series look rather than a railway series one, I'll be giving them separate grey faces rather than embedded ones. I've also given Victoria a driver, in contrast to her own show where the trains drive themselves. And so, here is Victoria as she looks in the show, and here is how she might look as a Thomas character. Next is Bakerloo. He is named after the Bakerloo line, the name of which is a portmanteau of Baker Street and Waterloo, the former name being the home of Sherlock Holmes, whom Bakerloo is based on. He likes to investigate things, but also has a tendency to jump to conclusions and be a bit forgetful. To be honest, I could imagine Bakerloo working quite well as a Thomas character and forming interesting dynamics with the Sodor engines, at least if you ignored the fact that there are no 3-rail electric lines on Sodor. In the show, Bakerloo's line serves a number of locations, perhaps most notably Mystery Mansion, an old castle with a very direct rail connection. I've decided to set this illustration at this station, since it's one of the more distinctive locations in the show. To be honest, it may be fun to make fun of the animation and visual style of Underground Ernie, but it's honestly pretty impressive just how many locations are present in the series. It definitely feels a lot more varied than the early CGI episodes of Thomas and Friends, with plenty of different locales that all feel distinct from one another. I've based Bakerloo on the 1938 London Underground stock, which would make him significantly older than Victoria. Bakerloo is still meant to be fairly old in the show, so it's not too bad I think. Plus, the more rounded roof design makes it fairly easy for me to adapt his deerstalker hat from the show into his Thomas-influenced redesign. Vehicle characters in Thomas and Friends generally don't have headwear, but sometimes characters may have design elements that resemble headwear, like the brim above Salty's face. I've added the Fat Controller and Lady Hat to the scene. Perhaps I should say the Stout Gentleman, since he's wearing his casual outfit. Lady Hat doesn't look particularly thrilled to see Bakerloo. "Topham, I thought we came here to get away from the trains." "But look, dear, it's Bakerloo, from that show about the talking trains." Bakerloo is, of course, happy to take the two of them where they need to go, as long as it's served by the railway, and preferably on his own line. But, with that said and done, here is Bakerloo's design from Underground Ernie. And here is how he might have looked in the Thomas style. He is technically a twofer, Hammersmith and City. Their name comes from, you guessed it, the Hammersmith and City line. Personality-wise, they're a bit like Donald and Douglas in the CGI era. They argue and bicker, but at the end of the day they'd never want it any other way. I've based Hammersmith and City on the London Underground C stock. Nowadays, the line is operated by the S stock, which is perhaps a bit more distinctive in appearance. However, Underground Ernie began airing in 2006, and the S stock didn't enter service until 2010. In fact, the S stock didn't start operating the Hammersmith and City line until 2012, so it doesn't make a lot of sense to base these characters on them. If the Thomasverse is anything like real life, this would mean that Hammersmith and City were retired from service in 2014 at the latest. Hopefully they've been preserved if so. In the show, Hammersmith and City's line serves a sports stadium and a fun fair. This might not sound weird on its own, but you perhaps weren't expecting to find out that the line travels straight through the fun fair and even does a loop-de-loop on the roller coaster. I would not be surprised if they had to be regularly taken off of regular service in order to have the vomit from nauseous passengers cleaned out from their interiors. That seems pretty grim, all things considered. If this was in the Thomas universe, then I don't think the line would connect directly with a roller coaster. It could still serve a fun fair or amusement park, but the railway and the roller coaster should be entirely separate. I decided to go for a sunset vibe with this illustration, which I think sets it apart from the other drawings. Well, that and the inclusion of the fun fair in the background. And so, here are Hammersmith and City in the underground Ernie style, and here they are as Thomas characters. Next we have Jubilee. Named after the Jubilee line, the newest line on the London Underground network, it is fitting that he is the youngest train in the show's main cast. I have thus based him on the 1996 stock, which continue to operate the Jubilee line to this day. Jubilee's colour scheme is perhaps the plainest of all the characters, being a silver grey with no lining. This matches the colour the Jubilee line is coloured on maps of the Underground, which in itself is a reference to Queen Elizabeth II's Silver Jubilee, after which the line is named. You'll have noticed by now that the trains in Underground Ernie all have symbols, or possibly cutie marks, on their side, which are variations on the London Underground totem symbol. Jubilee's includes the letter J with a swirl to match the @ symbol you might use for an email address or to tag another user on social media. It works well enough as a symbol, although I can't unsee the J as an upside down lowercase r. Jubilee is fun-loving, eager to please, and can sometimes be a bit cheeky, a bit like Percy in that sense. He's also a bit of a computer whiz, although I'm not sure how he's able to operate a computer. Maybe in the Ernie-verse there exist specific types of computer that trains can operate with their voice or cab controls or something like that. Whilst designing Ernie as a Thomas character, I decided to keep his eyes a sort of squarish shape, in reference to the old wives' tale about how spending too much time in front of a screen can give you square eyes. I also decided to include another vehicle in this illustration to go along with Jubilee, Ernie's inspection vehicle, Ernie 1. The show's design for Ernie 1 isn't based on anything specific in real life. I've mainly based my take on Ernie 1 off of the original design, albeit with some details lifted from the real-life battery electric locomotives that haul engineers' trains on the Underground. I've also given Ernie 1 a face, which it never had in the show. Maybe the implication is that, in the Ernie-verse, only Underground trains or multiple units have faces, whereas locomotives do not. They certainly do have faces in the Thomas-verse, however, so Ernie 1 is definitely alive. Drawing Ernie 1 also gives me an excuse to include Ernie in another drawing. Jubilee and Ernie 1 are at Shoppers Paradise, one of the main stations on Jubilee's line that connects directly with an indoor shopping centre. And so, here is Jubilee as he normally looks, and here he is as a Thomas character. What? How is it already broken? I only got it today. The final character we're covering today is Circle. She's a nature lover and likes to stay calm and laid back even when things go wrong. I've given her the same basis as Hammersmith and City, the C stock, since that's what would have operated the real Circle line at the time of the show's creation. Circle's design is interesting to say the least. She's always reminded me a bit of those caterpillar roller coasters you sometimes see at theme parks. Circle is perhaps one of the more infamous characters in the show, possibly due to the Bachmann model which, being part of a train set, was possibly the one model in the range that most people have seen. One complaint I have regarding the show's merchandise, which is maybe a bit late since they've been discontinued for about 20 years, is the faces. It's not so much that they're poorly sculpted, but it seems pretty clear to me that the people responsible for supplying the merchandise companies with production materials gave them images of the characters in a default pose, without the faces being made to smile or really emote at all. As such, most of the Underground Ernie toys depict the trains with neutral faces, whereas they'd have looked better if they were smiling, I think. The circle merchandise is particularly egregious in this department, because most of the time it just looks like she's squinting. It would be like if old Thomas merchandise gave him this face. Having said that, the Underground Ernie merchandise was generally pretty high quality from what I've seen, at least the die-cast and motorised toys. The Bachmann models are a bit cheap and plasticky, but it's not the end of the world, I suppose. I've drawn Circle getting some minor repairs done at the workshop, which gave me an excuse to draw Mr. Rails. They say he never fails, but clearly he has failed to hold all his tools at the same time, so most of them have fallen onto the track. He's a bit annoyed by this, but Circle just tells him, "Relax on your tracks." Whether or not that would work, I'm not too sure. I think Mr. Rails would just end up meeting a rather grisly demise. I've heard people say that Mr. Rails doesn't look as creepy as the other human characters in the show. I think this might just be down to the fact that Mr. Rails has more distinct features, so you don't notice the slight uncanniness as much with him. There are probably some of you who have met someone who perhaps looks a bit like Mr. Rails. Maybe Ernie himself would look less creepy if he more closely resembled his voice actor, Gary Lineker. Either that or he'd just wind up looking terrifying, one of the two. But, with that said, here is Circle as she appears in Underground Ernie. And here is what she might look like if she was a Thomas character. And there we are, the main cast of Underground Ernie, drawn in the style of Thomas and Friends. It's been nice revisiting this show after many years and drawing them in a style that I don't think many have attempted before. Let me know what you thought of the video by giving us a comment and a like, and be sure to subscribe.